In the years leading up to the Second World War, the United States was in the process of forming its first armored formations. However, the tank-producing industry faced significant challenges due to limited funding, the country's isolationist policy, and a lack of foresight among the Army's top brass. By the early 1930s, the US Cavalry sought its own tank to provide highly mobile fire support to its units. This need led to the creation of the M1 combat car, which became a precursor to the renowned American light tank series extensively used during the Second World War. The US Army first encountered tanks when the American Expeditionary Force arrived in Europe in 1917 during the First World War. With the gradual introduction of American forces into the European theater, the first mechanized American formation, the Tank Corps of the American Expeditionary Forces, was established that same year and equipped with British and French tanks. Inspired by these machines, the US Army began experimenting with various tank designs in the post-war years. However, progress was slow due to limited funding and the disbandment of the Tank Corps in 1919. Infantry-focused commanders of the time did not prioritize tanks, viewing them as unnecessary for guarding the nation's borders, the Army's primary concern. As a result, expensive breakthrough weapons like tanks were deemed less important and their development stagnated. In 1928, during a visit to Britain, U.S. Secretary of War Dwight F. Davis observed a demonstration of an experimental British armored brigade. This unit featured light and medium tanks, supported by motorized infantry and artillery. He returned home impressed by what he saw, and began advocating for the development of similar combined arms formations within the American military. This perspective was further bolstered in 1931 by the newly appointed Army Chief of Staff, General Douglas MacArthur, who also recognized the tank's potential and argued that they should not be confined solely to infantry support. Throughout the 1930s, the U.S. Infantry branch was solely responsible for tank development. However, the Cavalry branch also sought to improve its own capabilities by incorporating armored vehicles. Due to legislative restrictions, the Cavalry was prohibited from developing and owning tanks. To circumvent this barrier, they just labeled them as combat cars. This rebranding was somewhat ironic given that both the cavalry and infantry designs were developed and produced at the Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois. These combat cars were designed to perform the same support role as infantry's tanks. The key distinction, particularly in the early stages of tank development in the United States, was that the cavalry branch placed significant emphasis on equipping these vehicles with fully rotating turrets, while the infantry branch was content with the use of fixed superstructures instead. In 1933, the development of a new cavalry vehicle was initiated. The design aimed for a 6.3-ton vehicle with armor capable of resisting small caliber rounds and armament consisting of one 12.7mm 50 caliber heavy machine gun and two 7.62mm light machine guns. The vehicle's specifications included a maximum speed of 48 km per hour and an operational range of 160 km. Designated the T5 combat car, it shared several features with the infantry's light tank T2 to save on development costs and time. However, its most notable distinction was its suspension system, which utilized a newly developed volute spring suspension that was better suited for faster speeds. On the 9th of August 1933, the War Department approved the project. During its development, the T5 combat car initially featured two separate turrets, but this configuration was later replaced with a single turret borrowed from the T4E1. The first prototype was presented at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in late April 1934. After successful trials, the vehicle was officially adopted into service as the Combat Car M1, with production carried out by Rock Island Arsenal. Between 1935 and 1938, fewer than 90 vehicles of this type were manufactured. In 1940, the United States formed its first armored force, consolidating infantry and cavalry tanks into a single organizational structure, a change spurred by Germany's rapid victories over the Western Allies in 1940. The organizational change also prompted the renaming of certain vehicles, including the Combat Car M1, which was redesignated as the M1A1. Some sources also reference it as the M1A2. Additionally, there is evidence suggesting that this renaming process may have started as early as 1937, during which the term combat cars gradually vanished from military documentation. The M1 featured a relatively straightforward hull design divided into distinct compartments. At the very front was the drive compartment housing the drive units and transmission, safeguarded by an angled upper glacis plate. Positioned on the left side was a round-shaped opening for the hull machine gun ball mount. The central section housed the fully protected crew compartment with the turret positioned above. Towards the rear of the tank was the engine compartment, the rear of which was covered by a large ventilation grid. Throughout its life, the M1 was equipped with a series of modified Continental engines, the R670-3M, the R670-3C, the R670-5, and the W670-7. These engines provided a power range of 235 to 250 horsepower at 2400 RPM. With a fuel capacity of 190 liters and weighing just over 8.5 tons, the M1 combat car had an operational range of 190 kilometers on roads and 100 kilometers cross-country. With the best engine, the M1 combat car could achieve an impressive maximum speed of 72 kilometers per hour on paved roads, with a cross-country speed of 32 kilometers per hour. That's about 20 miles per hour. The M1 suspension featured 2 bogies, each with 2 doubled wheels per side, all suspended using vertical volute springs. It also included a front drive sprocket, 3 return rollers, and a rear-positioned idler. The M1 superstructure was a straightforward box-shaped design. Its front driver's plate included a single 2-piece rectangular hatch that also served as the driver's vision port. This plate slightly protruded from the rest of the superstructure, allowing for the addition of 2 smaller vision ports on each side. The M1's turret was shaped like a capital letter D, with flat sides, curved rear, and an angled front plate. Observation ports were situated on both sides, complemented by an additional port at the rear. Machine guns were positioned in the front openings. At the top of the turret, there was no commander's cupola. Instead, a large hatch was located towards the rear. The last batch of vehicles received a simplified 8-sided turret designed for the sake of reducing production costs and simplifying manufacturing processes. The M1 came armed with up to 4 machine guns. Positioned on the left side of the turret was the 12.7mm M2 heavy machine gun, accompanied by a 7.62mm machine gun on the right. Another 7.62mm machine gun was located on the right side of the hull, with an additional 30 caliber stored inside for potential anti-aircraft use. The ammunition load consisted of 1,100 rounds for the 50 cal and 6,700 rounds for the 30 cal. The M1 featured 16mm thick frontal hull armor with the upper glacis angled steeply at 69 degrees. The driver's plate, also 16mm thick, was positioned at a 17-degree angle. Side armor for both the hull and superstructure measured only 13mm or about half an inch, while the bottom, rear, and top armor were even thinner at 6mm. The turret boasted 16mm all around, with the front angled at 30 degrees, while the roof was only 6mm thick. The crew of the M1 consisted of 4 members, a commander, gunner, driver, and the driver's assistant. The commander and gunner occupied positions within the turret, while the driver and driver's assistant were housed in the front of the hull, with the driver positioned to the left and the assistant on the right. The US Army made several modifications to the M1 trying to make it better. Some of these variants also served as test beds for new ideas. In 1936, one M1 underwent testing with a new engine. The original Continental gasoline engine was replaced by an air-cooled Guberson radial diesel engine, boasting a power output of 220 horsepower at 2200 RPM. Following this upgrade, 3 more M1 tanks were selected for modification, now designated as M1E1. These modified tanks were then utilized for testing purposes at Fort Knox starting in early 1937. In the summer of 1937, the M1 tanks underwent additional testing and modifications. One tank in particular was extensively altered, especially in the rear engine compartment, which was modified in order to provide the crew with easier access. Additionally, the fuel capacity was increased. Another improvement involved a redesigned suspension system to minimize wobbling, achieved by relocating the rear idler further back and increasing the distance between the bogies. Furthermore, the number of return rollers was reduced to 2. This experimental variant was designated as the M1E2. Once prepared, this modified vehicle was dispatched to Aberdeen for testing, conducted from August to October 1937. Test results indicated that the revamped suspension significantly enhanced stability during both firing and overall driving maneuvers, albeit requiring slightly increased steering effort. The revised engine compartment was also regarded as an improvement. After successfully completing all the trials, the modified vehicle was then restored back to original M1 configuration. The successful implementation and testing of the modifications in 1938 led to the decision to procure additional vehicles. Between 24 and 34 of these modified units were manufactured under the designation M1A1, featuring newly simplified 8-sided turrets. Furthermore, a variant known as the M1A1E1, powered by Guberson engines, was also developed, with at least 7 tanks produced. Subsequently, the M1A1 combat car was later reclassified as the M1A1 light tank, serving as the foundation for the subsequent M2A3 light tank. In late 1938, the M1 was tested with T-27 rubber band tracks and a new transmission. At the request of the cavalry branch, the driveshaft was repositioned lower within the vehicle hull. Additionally, the designs of the road wheels, idler, and drive sprocket were modified. Despite the changes being considered positive, actually implementing them would have caused unacceptable delays in tank production. There were also proposals to use the improved M1E3 as the basis for self-propelled artillery, but these plans never progressed beyond the drawing board. In late 1937, another T5 project known as the T5E4 was initiated in order to evaluate a modified suspension system. This time, the original rear volute bogie was replaced with a torsion bar unit, and the rear idler was substituted with a ground-mounted trailing idler, changes that were intended to reduce ground pressure and improve the vehicle's overall performance. Testing began in early 1938 and yielded positive results, with the new idler greatly enhancing stability during firing and driving trials. However, despite the promising performance of the torsion bar unit, durability issues surfaced during testing. As a result, the design was not incorporated into production. The service history of the M1s was brief and uneventful. The initial batch of M1 tanks was assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division, where they saw use during the Army's summer maneuvers of 1936. Despite their adoption for service, the M1 tanks were never deployed in any combat operations, but instead primarily served as training vehicles until 1942, when they were ultimately retired from active service. This concludes our video on one of the United States' first modern light tanks, but what are your thoughts on the M1? Share your opinions in the comment section below. If you haven't done so already, we invite you to subscribe to stay updated on future content. If you'd like to contribute further, consider our Patreon or PayPal. Finally, we want to especially thank our medium and heavy tank Patreon supporters: Andrew Oberg, Dan Fitzpatrick, Dave Shuford, Leslie Hulkower, Michael Herman, Owen M., Peter Bradbury, and Wolfhund. Your generous contributions help fund our research, illustrations, and video production. To everyone else, thank you for watching, and until next time, keep us in your sights.